Good evening, everyone. First of all, happy Family Day to each of you. May each of you be blessed to share many, many more family days with your loved ones, both near and far, for many, many years to come. Welcome to the third of our three-part series entitled The Widening Divide, North American Jews and Israelis, in conversation with Salim Mansur, sharing outsider-insider perspectives. My name is David Schlanger, and I will be your moderator this evening. For those of you who are new to the series, let me just say that our esteemed outsider, so to speak, for the entire series has been Salim Mansur, Professor Emeritus in Political Science at the University of Western Ontario. Salim is a Muslim, born in Calcutta, India, and he immigrated to Canada in the early 70s. Salim has been a long-standing friend of the Jewish community. He's spoken and written extensively on the politics in the Middle East, Canada, the United States, and Asia. Our topic tonight is China and India, the rebirth of an Asian-centric age at the end of the Euro-centric age, and its impact on Jews in the diaspora and on Israelis, especially with regard to the widening divide between the two groups that we have been addressing these past few weeks. As in our two previous sessions, Salim will make his opening remarks, setting our framework for discussion, after which you're all invited to ask questions or add your own comments, insights, or opinions. Now, the preferred method of alerting me is to use the raise your hand icon that you will find by clicking the reactions icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Or you can ask a question using the chat function or by waving at me to catch my attention. I will try to be as fair as possible in determining an order, but as moderator, I will reserve the right to park a question for later or ask you to sum up your points more quickly if necessary. In any case, please don't take anything I say or do as moderator personally. So, Salim, during our one-on-one conversation on this topic just yesterday, in describing Israel's geographic positioning, you used a term that I found very useful for this evening's topic. You said that Israel was at the hinge point between Asia and Europe, and Africa for that matter. As we all know, Israel located at the westernmost extremity of Asia. I found the hinge point metaphor very appealing, as this tiny sliver of a country, Israel, appears like a hinge on a very large geographic door that used to be Euro-centric in its orientation, but is now swinging to become Asia-centric, away from a European reality where anti-Semitism is growing once again, towards what could be a more promising door that is Asia-centric. In other words, India, China, and the non-Arab Muslim world. And of course, how does the relationship with the United States fit into all of this? Is Israel tilting towards Asia? Is that indeed happening? And if so, is it a good thing, or yet again, a disappointing or even dangerous positioning? And how might this new orientation affect the widening divide that you've identified as our resident outsider? Salim, we welcome your expert observations and commentary. The Zoom is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the friends joining us this evening for what is our third session on this series of conversation that we've had. Let me first say shalom to all of you. Well, in the limited time for the opening remarks that I have, I want to frame for you this conversation, the emergence of the Asia-centric age in the 21st century against the backdrop of the fading away of the Euro-centric age in world history during our lifetime. At a minimum, for the past 300 years, Europe has been the lead actor in world affairs, and the rest of the world has been supporting actors. Eurocentric age was dealt a mortal blow by European actors themselves in the last century. The two world wars and the Cold War that followed, which fatally weakened Europe despite a subsequent effort to make a comeback with the making of the European Union as a Euro state. In this framing, one might also make the qualification that Eurocentric age was also the making of the Atlantic age that began with Columbus's voyage of discovery. The rise of China and India tips the balance away from the Atlantic and the Eurocentric age and global politics to the Pacific region and the Asia-centric age. The turbulence in world affairs that we have been witnessing is because of this global shift in process. And in the years ahead, it will become increasingly evident of the Asia-centric age has come about. So this is the big picture in which the lead actors will be non-European states, China, India, Indonesia, Japan, and alongside them will be the states of the Middle East, Asian actors. The United States and Canada will increasingly be drawn into the affairs of the Pacific Basin, as they were drawn into the affairs of the northern half of the Atlantic Basin. How does this global shift affect Israel and North American Jews? Will this shift widen the existing divide between Israelis and Jews in the North American diaspora? Or to slow down this widening Israelis and North American Jews divide will need for them to engage among themselves by keeping in mind and in focus the emergent new frame of world affairs. Israel, as David has just pointed out, is physically a minuscule state with a relatively small population on the western extremity of Asia, surrounded by Arab and Muslim states. At the time of his birth, based on UN Resolution 181 of November 1947, India voted against the resolution and China abstained. At the time, China was represented by the nationalist government of General Chiang Kai-shek. 2 years later, Chinese communists under Mao Zedong took power in mainland China, but was not admitted to the UN until 1971, when Taiwan, or the Republic of China, was unseated. Both China and India, as post-colonial developing countries, supported the view of the Arab Muslim bloc of countries that together with African and South American UN member states during the Cold War decades formed the non-aligned bloc. This bloc also became known as the Group of 77 when launched in 1964. And presently this group is a coalition of 134 developing countries in the UN. China and India, respectively, were vying for the leadership in this Asian and African bloc of countries, most of them emerging from colonial rule by European powers in the decades since the birth of Israel. And Israel was viewed in those early decades of the UN as a colonial settler state implanted by European powers in the middle of Arab countries. It is instructive here to recall that Britain, given the mandatory authority over Palestine by the League of Nations at the San Remo conference in April 1920 abstained from voting for UN Resolution 181, whereas France, the United States, and Russia, the three veto-holding powers, voted in favor of that resolution. This abstention is historically significant as it lent credence to the view of former African Asian colonies of Britain that the establishment of Israel was at the expense of Arabs in the Palestine Mandate. The rejectionism of Israel by the Arab League also isolated Israel among non-Arab states of Asia and Africa, including China and India. Furthermore, we need to keep in mind the role of the Soviet Union supporting the Arab League and the Group of 77 in driving a wedge between these former colonial societies and the European colonial rulers aligned with the United States in the Cold War against Moscow and its Eastern Bloc satellites. With the fall of Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, ending the Cold War, a new configuration of world affairs opened for Israel. China and India formally recognized and established full diplomatic relations with Israel in 1992. In the 3 decades since normalization, Israel has moved rapidly forward in deepening its relationship with both Beijing and New Delhi. And what this signifies is, if I may put them in these terms, the gravitational pull of these two most populous countries and ancient civilization, now emergent as global economic and military powers, Israel falling into its own historically natural orbital groove as part of Asia, strategically located as a hinge country on the Eastern Mediterranean with 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, meet or converges. It takes time for people to figure out their place in the cultural and physical map of the world. And normalization with China and India underscore the beginning for both Israel and its Arab and Muslim neighbors of rethinking their history, culture, and political alignments. This process is beginning to forge Israel's relation with Arab and Muslim states that the Abraham Accords represent, and in which the old image of Israel as a colonial settler state implanted by European powers in the Middle East will be replaced within the framework of the Asia-centric age as a state of the people returned to their ancestral home. In other words, this retooling of the image of Israel as a European implant could not have been advanced as it came to be since the end of the Cold War without the normalization and deepening of Israeli relations with China and India. What might be the meaning in historical and cultural terms for Israel in its political realignment as an Asian state in the making of an Asian-centric age? It means moving away and out of the Euro-centric configuration of history and culture in which the European politics of anti-Semitism stigmatized Jews as a people with consequences for both Jews and Europeans that stain Europe's history. And time has not, and likely will not, wash them away in its entirety. Anti-Semitism is a European disease. Asian culture and history are not burdened with this disease, though it does show up among Asians, particularly the Muslim population in Asia infected by this European disease. It will be useful to recall that segment of Jewish population in Europe that found refuge in China and India before and during Shoah, when most European countries, including Canada and the United States, closed their doors to Jews seeking an escape from Germany after Hitler came to power. Since Asians have no or very little baggage of anti-Semitism, Israel is not burdened to contend with that religious, cultural history and its attendant bigotry among Asian states, following China and India, normalize their relations with Israelis. We need to keep this in mind when we refer to those Asian states that have large or majority Muslim populations. And the example of this is in the promising exchanges that have taken place between religious leaders of some 200 million Indian Muslims that makes India the second largest Muslim country in the world, and religious leaders of Jews in Israel. There is none or very little traction for any boycott and sanctions movement of Israel in China and India. And the example on this matter of these two Asian giants on other Asian countries is that any such effort to boycott or isolate Israel in the Asian milieu will be self-defeating for those states. As I mentioned in the first session of these conversations we are having, more Arab states would have come on board the Abraham Accords, including Saudi Arabia, and the momentum would have spread rapidly among non-Arab Muslim majority states in Asia, such as Indonesia, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Central Asian states, former Soviet republics. Both China and India offer to Israel markets with huge potential of growth, given their appetite for technology transfer in agriculture, water, and related needs, pharmaceutical, avionics, computing, military and security, transportation, communication, education, health, and collaborative work at the frontiers of science and industry. In return, Israel has become an attractive and dynamic center on the strategic western perimeter of Asia for Chinese and Indian investments, as it has become for those Arab states on board the Abraham Accords. Here we need to note that there are also differences between China and India that Israel have to contend with and navigate given its own history. China is a totalitarian communist state, and the record of China's human rights violation is grim. Israel is a country whose people have been victims of human rights throughout their history in exile. How Israel navigates through these treacherous waters when it comes to maintain its relations with China will be a continuing challenge, both from within Israel and from those outside Israel who do not either wish Israel well, or those who seek every opportunity to vilify Israel on issues, but do not raise their eyebrows when other states are engaged similarly. India, on the other hand, is the world's largest functioning democracy, and relations between Indians and Jews have a long history. Jewish presence in ancient India dates back to the period of the Babylonian captivity, right up to the immediate decade after the birth of Israel. Both India and Israel, as ancient people and new states, were driven in those early years of their independence by choices made reflecting the immediate circumstances of their politics. India moved in the post-independence period to build relations with other post-colonial states, and Israel was viewed as an obstacle for India's relations with member states of the Arab League. It was also complicated by India's partition with the making of Pakistan as a Muslim majority state. And India, in contending with Pakistan, needed to prevent Pakistan from isolating India from Arab and Muslim states of the Middle East. That aspect of India-Pakistan contention is now behind India. And the blossoming of India-Israel relations is not only an indicator of that history left behind, but also that India is reaching out to Israel after 1992 with reciprocal visits of Indian and Israeli leaders are indicators of that ancient connection between Indians, Hindus, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Christians, and Muslims that make up India's multi-religious heritage, and Jews restored in the new setting of the emergent Asia-centric age. The difficulties, to conclude my opening remarks, as they arise, that Israel will face going forward in the Asian-centric age, will deal with them, Israelis will deal with them on the basis of their national interests. For the first time in 2,000 years, Israelis are on the driver's seat of their own destiny. And how Israelis deal with them might be matter of contention with North American Jews. And the challenge for Jews in North America also for the first time will be one that is new and one that will need a greater awareness of the Eurocentric age that Israelis will increasingly leave behind as they become integral to the emergent Asia-centric age. Thank you.
Salim, listening to your opening remarks, I truly hope that many of the things you said are going to happen and are true. This is a very difficult time in the world to trust relationships and to forge new ones, especially if you think about China, as you've mentioned. So I'm going to open it up to anybody who has a comment or question or insight that they would like to share. I'm going to give the floor to Sidney Goldenberg.
Thanks, David, and thank you, Salim, once again for a very illuminating and useful perspective on a macro scale in terms of global geopolitics. But I think we both agree that the immediate and most severe peril that Israel is facing is from Iran, which has surrounded Israel with its proxies, from the Shia militias in Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon to Hamas in Gaza to the Houthis in Yemen and its own ships in the Mediterranean. And it is implacably proceeding with its nuclear arsenal development and its hegemonic ambition to dominate the Middle East and to eliminate Israel. And it's also clear at this point that Israel has been abandoned by the United States, which is firmly allied with Iran, whether it's Rob Malley's hypnotic impact upon weak-minded Biden or whatever the explanation is. The U.S. can no longer be counted upon to do anything to help Israel to face this peril. Indeed, is on the contrary, enabling Iran through sanctions relief and a farcical revival of the JCPOA to proceed with its project without hindrance. So my question is, before we get into long-term prospects and perhaps encouraging prospects of what might happen with China and India in the long run, is there any indication that any of the Asian powers, or India or China, and I think China is actually having dealings with Iran right now and is a pretty treacherous regime to rely on, but is there any indication that Israel can have any comfort from those powers in assisting it, because it appears to need assistance to deal with Iran, and it appears that the only way that it can deal with it successfully is with a preemptive strike that will take out its nuclear installations, and simultaneously would have to be attacking Hezbollah and Iran. This is very, very serious problem that Israel is facing. Is there any indication, now that we know that we'll get no help from the West, that it might get help from those powers in Asia?
Well, Sydney, I mean, your question leads one to, or will lead one to speculate on those aspects of Israeli politics and Israeli response, which remains deliberately on the part of the Israelis in great opaqueness. They wouldn't want to discuss it. We are not going to be able to, whatever we say is not only hypothetical, but might be totally off the record. But from a historical perspective, I will recall for you, Sydney, and I hope you will see what I'm leading towards, that the threat from Iraq, the OSIRAC reactor and all of that emerged in the late 70s, through the 70s. And by the way, the Iraqi situation, that Saddam Hussein and Saddam's regime's effort to acquire nuclear weapons came about, again, through European sources, right? I mean, if you remember, France was at the leading edge of providing the technical and scientific support to the Saddam regime and so on. Well, history is repeating itself with Iran. Again, the backing is from the European sources, the P5 countries. So when Israel was confronted with that situation as it was growing, the threat was growing greater, Israel was practically alone. There was the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, but Egypt was not going to be an actor in whatever Israel, did or did not do. And Israel acted alone in dealing with the threat. And so we know the result. In the case of Iran today, in the third decade of the 21st century, Israel is not alone. That changes the whole strategic map around Israel. Israel is not alone in the sense that, Iran's threat is not only to Israel, of course, to Israel it is in that extermination sense, but Israel's threat is also to some of the other Arab states, including Saudi Arabia. It was not insignificant that just before President Herzog traveled to UAE, the Houthis were firing rockets, long-range, medium-range missiles into United Arab Emirates. So, I mean, now the strategic situation for Israel is rather different. I will also recall for you, and you can draw your own conclusions, but it's significant that when the Iran deal was being negotiated by the Americans and their European partners with Iran, Israel had worked out a relationship with Azerbaijan, which is a Muslim majority country on the borders of Iran, for whatever would be needed for preemption. And it was the Obama administration that leaked those arrangements. So that the context has changed. I'm not minimizing the threat. The context has changed. And in the change of the context is that there are Arab states now allied with Israel, but more importantly, there are states like China and India are allied with Israel. China and India have their own relationship with Iran, But that relationship that they have with Iran is more than balanced with their relationship with Israel. And in that sense, Iran is not in a position, I would argue, to unilaterally engage with Israel as Israel develops deeper and deeper relationship with its Arab neighbors and with other Asian states.
Okay, I'm going to move to Goldie Steiner. I've got Goldie, then Jerry, and then Peter Seligman. Before I hand it over to Goldie, I always like to do this. Goldie is the founder of Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights. A fantastic book, if you haven't read it, is The Jewish People's Rights to the Land of Israel by Solomon ben Zimra. There it is on the screen. It is the definitive, we lost Solomon a few years ago. It is the definitive history of what the true story is. I highly recommend it to anybody, and it's available through Amazon. Okay, Goldie, I'm going to unmute you.
First of all, thank you, Salim, for your wonderful presentation. And I love the words when you said that Israel is in the driver's seat of its own destiny. I wish it was so, and I hope it's going to be so. I'm going to go back a little bit to the recent background of our history. In 1946, the United Nations General Assembly met after the League of Nations shifted into the United Nations. It was the end of the Euro-centric era for the Jews, and the European Jewish population was reduced as they fled to the United States. I will talk more about that after my next statement. The mandate of the United Nations was to create peace and unity in the world with aims to reconciliation of peoples. And look where we are today. When out of 192 members of the UN, with the exception of a few, the United Nations General Assembly approved an open-ended international investigation against Israel. And Jews fled to the US, where they found a safe haven after the Second World War. They prospered economically as well as socially, as they integrated into the highest echelons of society. Yet, only 70 plus years later, there is a fast-growing, a raging anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism throughout the states. And today, formerly proud Jews, for the most part, are hiding their Jewish identity and criticize and even bash Israel. Again, 70 plus years later, where are we? Of particular concern is the toxic atmosphere in academia, even or especially in institutions of higher learning, well-funded by third world anti-democratic rulers. The next generation is being indoctrinated with wokeism, cancel culture, Marxist tropes, etc. What will the next world leaders contribute to the world? Again, 70 years later, where are we? And the question to you, Salim, what can be expected of the newly forged Asian-centric relationship with the Jewish state? Can this chronic Jew hatred cited above be cured? In this era of advanced vaccine discoveries, is there an antidote against anti-Zionism? Thank you, Salim. To you.
Well, I will be only repeating myself, Goldie, that anti-Semitism is a European disease to the extent it infected Asian population, particularly Asian Muslims. It was brought by and spread by the Europeans. Asians have no basis, no history, no legacy of anti-Semitism. The history of India, the history of Japan, the history of China, or go to any of the other countries, Philippines, Vietnam. These are not societies burdened with a history of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a European phenomenon. The Asian-centric age will be one in which the Asians deal with Jews and Israelis as part of their own milieu. To the extent that there will be grievances, there will be grievances just as there are grievances between India and China. That is their own particular history upon which there will be divisions, maybe conflict. As some of you might already know or might know, that India and China fought a border war in the 1960s. And what began as a relationship in the immediate post-independent period soured. But India and China are both working through those difficulties. Both are nuclear power countries, both have their own ambition, just as Japan does, just as any of those other Asian states does. But in that history, there is no trace of anti-Semitism. And the re-blossoming, for instance, of the Indian-Israeli relationship, at the heart of which, or at the center of which, is the fact that India is the second largest Muslim country. And as I pointed out, the Muslim religious leaders of 200 Indian Muslims are engaged in a deepening relationship with their counterparts in Israel. This is not reported in the Western press. This is not reported by others. Possibly you do not know about it, but this is what is happening. And the Abraham Accord is the platform that is transformative, both in real time as we're speaking, and in its potential effect going forward. So the difficulties that have existed are the difficulties of the residual effects in terms of anti-Semitism, I'm talking about, residual effects of European history in Asia, in Africa, because the people of Asia and Africa do not carry the virus of anti-Semitism in their historical, cultural, political DNA.
I will follow up myself on that, Salim. How is that manifesting itself in world opinion, in votes at the UN? We don't see them voting in favor of Israel. Is that changing? Do you think that's going to change? Apartheid state, Israel is an apartheid state. You don't think that that is heard by the Asia-centric countries?
Yes, it is heard. It is heard, and it is reflected in the UN General Assembly vote. And possibly it will continue to be forthcoming in the short term, in the near future. But what has changed, and as I said in my opening remark, it takes time for people to readjust their cultural and historical maps. The Cold War years, which is the years in which Israel was established, and where the intensity of the conflict between Israel and its neighboring states took place. I'm not here indicating the activities of non-state actors like Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. I'm talking about the state, represented in the UN. So the Arab League states, Muslim states, and so on. And that conflict was worsened, deepened by the use that the Soviets made of driving a wedge between the Afro-Asian states and the Western states, So to give a good example of this is that the original sponsors and funders of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and various other organizations associated with the Palestinian Liberation Organization or under the umbrella of the PLO was provided by Moscow. both diplomatically, militarily, and in all different ways, logistically, arms, equipment, that happened in the period that the Soviet Union was the dominant or one of the two dominant superpowers of that time. Now, with the change in the situation that has taken place with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of the other republics that have taken place, that dynamic is gone. Now, what remains of the PLO gets its support not from former Soviet republics or from Moscow. It gets it directly from the European states, the biggest funders of the European state. So yes, to the extent that the European states are going to continue to make the argument, as they have been making, that Israel in its relationship with the Palestinians demonstrate all the nature of an apartheid state, this is going to fuel the animus also in other Asian states. But what is notable, I'm arguing, is that the non-Muslim Asian states in particular, and India is one of them, which has the second largest Muslim population, but India, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, etc., they do not carry that virus, or they are burdened with that history, or they are going to single out Israel in terms of what is the anti-Semitic trope. That direction in which history is going to move in the Asia-centric age will mean, to the extent anti-Semitism is used as a way to beat up Israel inside the United Nations, is being fueled and will be fueled by the European states.
Well, let's just hope that the balance that you're talking about, it will actually happen, and there will be a counter, voice. I could ask more questions, but I'll save them because I want to move to the list. I have Jerry and then Peter. Is there anyone else that has been waving or? Okay, so Jerry.
Thank you very much. And Salim, a thank you from us too here for your opening remarks. You always manage to set out such a clear landscape, in setting up your thesis for our discussions. It's much appreciated. I want to just, I'm going to ask you a question, but I just want to give you my thesis on this, my theory on this swing, this pivot by Israel to the Asian part of the globe, let's put it that way, and away from Europe. I think in a way that if Israel could completely wash its hands of any dealings, any commercial, economic dealings with Europe, that it would, because the history is so poisonous that I think that it is, as you said, in a way, in its own driver's seat to pick and choose who it would like to deal with in the future. And so I think I see a number of very common elements, believe it or not, between this nation, Israel, that has a population of about 9 million people, of which about 6.5 million are Jews and the rest are Arabs, Arab Muslims, doing business with India, which has a population of 1.2 billion, maybe something like that, China in the same category, and Indonesia is also a very large population, almost entirely Muslim, the largest Muslim population on the planet. And in a way, sorry, not in a way, we know that those Asian countries that you've been describing and that I just mentioned are generally homogeneous populations. Homogeneous, certainly in a religious, in a cultural sense. Of course, there's no anti-Semitism in China. China is a homogeneous population, and I think has probably no immigration coming into it from anywhere. India is also a secular, well, no, I shouldn't say it. It has large religious components, but it is also, I think, protected in a way by its history from this anti-Semitism. So here's my question. Would it be fair to say that if you match up some of the attributes and qualifications of tiny Israel with the same attributes and qualifications that exist in these massive countries of India and China and a combination of other Asian countries as trading partners, do you think really that Israel could hold its own there? Certainly, if it can benefit enormously from those relationships. That's my question.
Well, the short answer is, how is Israel is perceived by the Asian states? Not only the giant Asian states, but Asian states in general. How is Israel perceived? Well, in the first 3-4 decades of Israel's birth, that is from 1940s, late 1940s, through to the end of the Cold War, 1992, Israel was perceived basically as a European implantation. It was perceived that way because that was the narrative by which not only the Arabs projected what had happened, it was the Jewish writers themselves projected what had happened. You know, the term Israel as a colonial settler state was popularized by the French Marxist historian, Maxime Rodinson, a French Jew. And the list of writers and thinkers on the left who popularized that notion is very, very long. You know, neither you nor I have the time to go through that list, but I can count for you names. These are names that are not coming from the Arab and Muslim thinkers and writers. These are lists of names whose writings became popular among the Arabs and the Muslim thinkers and writers, including myself when I was in school and college. You know, I mean, everybody will recognize the name like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, but names coming out of Israel like Ilan Halavi, Ilan Pape, Benjamin Beit Halami, and so Israel Shahak, their writings were turned into, you know, translated into Arabic, into Persian, and circulated across the Arab Muslim world. You know, that gave credence to the argument that Israel is an implantation, is an imperial, you know, ploy to basically control and defeat the aspirations of Arabs and Muslims. And therefore, I pointed out to you, Gary, out to everyone, Gary, that in the critical vote that gives birth to Israel, UN Resolution 181, India and China voted, China abstained, India voted against. But Britain abstained when Britain was the mandatory power. And if you go deep digger into these matters, the Americans, if President Truman had not been approached in private and personal manner by Chaim Weizmann, the vote of the Americans would have gone differently. Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, was entirely opposed to the making of Israel. So the historic, and the Soviet Union in 1947 voting on that resolution was voting for political grandstanding. It voted in the UN for UN Resolution 181 when Stalin was unfolding the doctor's plot as the last act to destroy whatever remains of Russian Jewry. We need to keep all of that history in some ways in context as we're talking about the shift that is taking place. So yes, that entire generation of Arabs and Muslims who grew up under colonial rule, where, and I'm not saying this to excuse any one of them, I'm saying that's the education. They grew up infected by the anti-Semitic virus that was circulated by the Europeans, including I would say, that biggest fraud in history, the Protocols of Zion. You know, it is a European production, Russian production, that then was translated and spread right across that part of the world, okay? So yes, it infected them, but this infection is not deeply structured, as I would repeat myself, in the political, cultural, and historical DNA of the Chinese people, of the Indian people, of the Filipinos, Vietnamese, Koreans, Japanese, as they are with the French, the Italians, the Germans, the Nordics, the English, and so on, right? As I pointed out in my opening remarks, the boycott, sanction movement, BDS movement, has no traction, no appeal in Asia. You never hear about people running around with BDS. But yes, people of Asian origin in North America, in University of Toronto, in American schools and colleges, are pushing that agenda. But pushing that agenda under whose umbrella? If the university authority says that this is not a platform for your Israeli apartheid hate speech, and we will not allow it, the story will immediately end. The same thing applies within the UN framework. If the UN framework, the leading member states, which happen to be European and North American, do not push this narrative, then the narrative pushed by the Arab leagues or the Muslim states will wither away. It will have very little traction. As I'm speaking right now, the Palestinian rapporteur at the UN is a Canadian from my university. I don't know how many people would know that. Michael Link. The name tells you, just as it was Richard Falk. Michael Link is not a Jew, but Richard Falk was a Jew. The most vitriolic Palestinian rapporteur that Michael Link is now replacing, who is a far more sophisticated anti-Semite. I know because I know him personally. So the problems are, we have to know where it emanates from. It is not the Japanese who are pushing the motion for, unseating Israel. The motion, if it is being pushed, it is being pushed by the Arab League state with the full backing of those states who are deeply infected with anti-Semitism. We don't want to talk about that. Well, that might be another problem because we are where we are. And as a result of this situation, the dilemma is on the North American Jews, not on the Israelis, because as we talked about this matter in our last session, in the second session on UN and globalism, as I mentioned, the Israelis do not keep awake at night thinking about anti-Semitism and BDS. They are dealing with other challenges and other difficulties. It is North American Jews who spend sleepless nights thinking about anti-Semitism and BDS. As it is recently as was stated, and stated not only by those people who have made their travels with the President of Israel and ministers to the Abraham Accord countries, it was stated by Americans themselves that you feel more safe in Dubai wearing your kippah than you feel safe in New York, in Brooklyn Heights wearing your kippah.
Thank you, Salim.
That is the dynamic change that is taking place in world politics.
All right, I want to make sure we can get everybody in here. So I've got Peter, Stephen, and then Maxine. And if we have time, we'll go back to, I think Sydney had his hand up there, right? Okay. Okay, Peter, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, you mentioned that North American Jews will have to deal with this differently, that it's an Asian-centric. Can you explain how it'll be different for us, other than the fact that most North American Jews are of European descent?
Well, the second part of it tells a big story, you know, in terms of anti-Semitism. But here's a pointer, which was embedded in my opening remarks. The relationship with China and Israel, India and Israel, that Israel is both engaged in and is going to pursue for reasons to the needs and benefit of Israel, will be questioned by the North American Jews, because the North American Jews live in a different environment. It'll be questioned, how is it that whether it was Benjamin Netanyahu or now Naftali Bennett, the future Lapid, they are engaging with the Chinese who have blood on their hand, who's the most vicious totalitarian state. How do Israel excuse or stand in a way going about with the Chinese, when others now are talking about, especially in North America and Europe, will talk about China in terms of what I've just laid out. So that is going to pose an immense difficulty in this inside dialogue among Jews, you know, that is the North American Jews and the Israelis, you know. Are you going to understand the Israelis? Are you going to trust the Israelis? Are you going to be, you know, sensitive to the Israeli situation? That dealing with China is not about approving Chinese behavior in terms of human rights violation and genocide and so on and so forth. But it is something that the Israelis need to pursue as a small country of 9 million people in terms of their own national interests, business opportunities, markets, and so on and so forth, and leave it to the Israelis to be discreet about it and how they distinguish the relationship that can harm, as a result of the relation with China, the victims of China, or how, you know, Israel can step aside and make selective choices in that relationship, which is a troubled relationship, and nobody's hiding from that. But then those people who are going to accuse Israel, I'm talking about the states, apart from the inside dialogue among Jews, to which North American Jews will have to respond, are groups and entities like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the BDS movement, the academics and professors and journalists in North American media.
We have our own battle here, that's for sure. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to move to Stephen, if you'll unmute.
Thank you, David. Pardon me. Salim, it was, firstly, it's great to see and hear you again. It's been a while, and I value that a lot. It was earlier stated, I think, by Sydney that the United States has essentially turned its back on Israel. I'd kind of like your comment about that. My understanding is that there are some vocal extremists in the United States who get a lot more press than they probably deserve, who give the flavor of the United States being turning to Israel. I just wonder whether you are in agreement with that. My understanding is that the United States support of Israel financially and militarily is still unparalleled and is actually increasing. So I'd like your view about that. And secondly, if the history of the Jewish people has been itinerant throughout the millennia, and there was a time in the last century when the promised land was North America, and people were striving besides Israel to get to North America. And that's why we have such a vocal presence in North America. My question of you is this: if things do turn bad, I mean, there's a lot of press about it and so on, but I just don't get the feeling that it's really as ugly as the press and others and some vocal people are making out. But if the world does turn bad for the Jews in North America, do you see the diaspora moving from Israel, from North America to Asia?
Well, it is happening from Europe, isn't it? Jews leaving from France, Jews leaving from other parts of Europe, where there has been an increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence, as in Spain or Italy, due to the influx of new immigrants from North Africa, Africa, and other parts of the Middle East, along with the old immigrants from this part of the world that has remained in some sense still committed to the old language of rejectionism, that began with in the period after Balfour Declaration. So Jews have left, and more Jews possibly will leave. I don't know about North American Jews, I mean, there is that internal tension, and this is something for you all to talk about and think about, the internal tension between Reform and conservative Jews and the greater, how should I phrase it? Strength, political strength of the Orthodoxy, the Haredi, and that movement, and therefore there is some tension in that situation, and how this will be resolved, I have no idea. But I would imagine that the relationship that I see opening up and has opened up with the Abraham Accord offers newer possibilities for the Jews, both in North America and in Israel, if there is a coordinated effort to take opportunity of those new openings. I mean, I don't think in terms of immigration, I don't think anybody is immigrating to India or China or Japan, but in terms of all that which the Jews have been such amazingly exceptional people in business and sciences and all of the other human endeavor that is desired by these new states of Asia. And the Jews have the capacity to offer those new states what they excel in. And that's what I, in a sense, had in mind to say to I think it was Gary I was responding to, how the Jews are perceived by the Asian states and people in Asia as opposed to the European. The people in Asia are new states. These are old societies, new states. And one of the perception that is there, and it is only going to grow, is that Israel is a new state. How has Israel so successfully developed that state to be what it is and has become? Israel becomes a model. And if those states that want to then achieve similar growth and development, the Israeli example stands right in front of them, and Israel has that opportunity, which is what is now being displayed in its relationship with India, for instance, and even with China. You know, I mean, China has become one of the very large investors in Israel, especially in Israeli think tanks, laboratories, universities. So, and India is following suit. So, I think we are, in a sense, entering a new chapter that only took time to come about, but it was going to come about, and it is now happening.
I'm just going to ask Stephen, I know you asked the two questions. Do you feel that you got a response to, I know you got a response to one of them, on the other one? You want to?
I gather time is limited, David,
Right.
but Salim, if you do, the history of the Jews has been the wandering Jew. The other part of the question was whether or not you see the prospect of the diaspora, the center of the diaspora shifting from North America to Asia in time, or do you feel that that's not a likelihood?
I don't know how to answer Stephen's question. I don't know whether the North Americans are going to, exchange their living in the North American diaspora for moving out to Indian or Chinese diaspora. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer. But yes,
throw something else. I'll throw something else into the pot. That stat that I heard. We have a lot of Israelis leaving Israel and coming to North America. A huge number, and I think I heard a stat that I could not believe. I'd have to look it up. A million. That's crazy to think about, but when you're living in a state that is facing existential threat of existence versus living in North America, there are different things at play. That's all I'll say. I have Maxine, and then I'm going to defer to Sharon, and then back to you, Sydney, if we have time. Okay, Maxine?
Thank you very much. Actually, it's Lionel Gann who has the question. He's right here beside me.
Hi, how you doing, everybody? The question I have is regarding the Trump administration previous and his formulation in helping to form the Abrahamic Accords. If, and it seems it might be possible that Trump will be reelected, do you feel that the United States will again move closer to Israel? When we look at the effect that Biden has being a negative effect, do you think that Trump will hasten other countries joining the Abrahamic Accords? That's my question. Thank you.
Mine would be a very short answer. Trump's return, if he does return, will be picking up where he was interrupted, where the process was interrupted by the Biden administration, and the process will once more be resurrected and will continue, because the argument, the logic, and the principles involved in that framework will not have been gone obsolete or would have eroded just because of the Biden interruption. What it means is, it is sort of now in a pause, and that pause will be removed and things will move forward.
I'll just add that the current 4 participants in the Abraham Accords did not shift allegiances when the Gaza war happened, which is a wonderful sign whether Trump was president or not. And there's such tremendous growth in trade and commerce between Israel and those 4 that I'd like to think that no matter what happens, the Abraham Accords has some strength on its own. I'm going to move to Sharon. Sharon Wolf, would you please unmute?
No, I was going back to Stephen's first question because I thought it wasn't answered when I put up my hand, because I thought what I heard Stephen say was that United States is increasing and giving Israel the support it needs in terms of arms and money. And it has not turned its back, which is sort of what Sydney was saying. So I'm still not clear. I didn't think Stephen got a real answer to his question. And that's why I put my hand up. But then when Stephen asked his question, he changed it. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's why I went back to Stephen.
I'm
So
sorry.
let's go
Sorry.
to Salim.
But yeah,
Salim,
I'd love Salim to answer that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if I understand the question, it is asking me that the American administration support, that is the current administration support for Israel, remain as firm and strong, correct me if I'm wrong, as firm and strong as it has been. And there is no fundamental diminishing of that relationship. And I would say if that is so, then it is all for the good. You know, that there is no difficulty or problem there. And I would hope that it remains so.
Salim, do you believe that to be so?
Well, I don't believe that is so, because, you know, in terms of looking at it comparatively to what this administration is doing in terms of what the previous administration did is quite different. Most importantly and emphatically in the area of the Iran deal. Trump tore up the Iran deal.
Mm-hmm.
Biden has rebooted the Iran deal. But if you want to go right into the weeds of the Iran deal in terms of politics, you will note that the Democratic Party basically went against not only the Jewish interests in terms of Iran deal, that is more emphatically the Israeli situation, but they worked to upturn their own, that is America's own constitutional requirement in processing the Iran deal. I'll just give you one simple point. Any foreign treaty negotiated by the administration, any administration, that is the president as the executive, and in charge of foreign policy in the terms of making deals and treaties, have to get that treaty through the Congress, that is the Senate, and the Senate has the final say on it. And what it requires, what the president needs, is 2/3 of the Senate vote. The most telling example of that absence of 2/3 Senate vote for a treaty negotiated by a president was when the Senate refused President Woodrow Wilson in terms of his negotiating the Treaty of Versailles that would have put United States into the League of Nations. What happened in the Iran deal with Obama was they turned the whole thing around and put the vote to ask not for approval of the Iran deal, but for the disapproval of the Iran deal. And immediately, the Democratic Party had 34 votes on the table, which meant, you know, that Obama had the deal in his pocket. He did not have the 67 votes. It would require 67 votes to disapprove the deal. Having 34 votes of the Democrats in his pocket meant that if there was a disapproval, which was not there, but if tested, there was a disapproval, then the president could override the veto. That's how the Democrats played the Iran deal, apart from the fact that, you know, in that deal, they went along with the European, or they herded the Europeans together along with Germany. So it became United States plus P5. Well, that tells you the story of the difference between the Democratic administration and where the Democratic administration have gone over the years in contrast to the Republican administration?
Well, it seems that in every one of these sessions, we end up going Democratic, Republican, and we're trying to debate it. And we hear our news sources from various different sources. And so we have our different viewpoints and so forth.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is a fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Biden administration did return all the financing to the UN organizations that are not in the best interest of Israel, and two, Palestinian aid has been returned by the Biden administration. I'm going to move to Sidney Goldberg.
Salim, I totally agree with you, of course, that the situation with Iran as opposed to Iraq is very different, but than it was then when the Osirak reactor was taken out. But the threat from Iran is as you know, is of an enormously different order of magnitude than anything that was going on with Iraq. And and of course, I also agree that the complexion, the relationship of Israel with its proximate Arab states is very different now as a result of the Abraham Accords. But as you know, Saudi Arabia was directly attacked by Iran. Its oil fields were directly attacked some time ago. And the UAE has been recently attacked by the Houthis in Yemen. And neither one of them did anything significant to retaliate, as far as I know, with respect to those attacks. Neither one of those powers, nor, although they're friendly to Israel and will assist Israel, presumably as much as they can, it seems to me that there's only two elements of sufficient weight to restrain Iran and to join in Israel and effectively restrain Iran. One is enormous economic pressure, such as was created by the sanctions regime, and the other is the threat of military force. And at one point, the U.S. appeared to be on side to do one or both of those, and that has now clearly been abandoned by the United States, can be counted upon to do neither, and is in fact acting in the opposite interest to facilitate Iran's hegemonic and nuclear ambitions. So my question is, and you gave some sort of general indication that perhaps China and India, because of their closeness to Israel and their much different assessment of the importance of Israel vis-a-vis Iran, with which they also have dealings, but they have a much better sense of balance. Do you see any prospect that either of them would actually be willing to engage in one or both of those methods of restraining Iran, to resort to and impose upon Iran severe economic pressure or the threat of military force, because nothing less will do if Iran is to be restrained in its campaign against Israel?
Not hypothetical of what might happen in the future, but going back to looking at it in terms of the recent past, the Chinese have absolute need in the sense of their energy requirement not to, in any way stop or put obstacles in the way of their energy need. So ironically, with the whole Ukraine fabricated crisis, Russia is going to become one of the big source of energy need for China. So that's I'm diverting away a little bit. But with Iran, no, that is not on the card from China. But with India, during the Trump administration, part of the geostrategic move in terms of the Asian Pacific basin that Trump was moving towards was a sort of bringing about the China containment policy, which had been the Soviet containment policy in the European theater. So that was being brought into effect. And President Trump was deeply engaged in those discussions, and India would have been one of the key players in that containment policy for China. And in terms of that policy, India would then be much more favorably disposed in any of the sanction regime that is put to contain Iran or to put pressure on Iran. and President Trump was also engaged in that discussion, and India would be a major actor in that issue. That is the bargaining that has to be done, but that bargaining is no longer on the table. That bargaining, that negotiation, those thinking is gone under the Biden administration. There is no sanction regime on Iran. It has pulled out of it. As I said, it has rebooted the Iran deal. This is the third term of Obama administration, as you have pointed out. I agree with you completely. And so we are in that situation in which the pressures that can be brought upon Iran is missing because the leadership in Washington is missing. The only thing that we can look forward to, if there's a change in administration and a Republican administration comes back, then one could expect that the Republican administration will pick up where the Trump administration left behind. But in the meantime, I would still maintain the view that behind the scene, whatever the Israelis are negotiating as a result of the Abrahamic Accord in terms of a collective defense against Iran, we are not privy to it, but in terms of what is the Gulf Cooperation Council, those of you who may not know about the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council was founded or formed in the years immediately after the Iranian Revolution. So these are Arab states on the Gulf who formed this GCC with Saudi Arabia at its head or in its leading position to basically shield themselves from the Iranian Revolution, even if they were not engaged or were going to engage in any manner to overthrow the Iranian regime. It was an active defense structure that they put in place. Ironically, Iraq was in some ways involved with that GCC setup, but now Iraq is more or less an Iranian proxy state in terms of a Shia majority. So Iraq is no longer there, but all the other Gulf states are there, from Oman to Kuwait. And they're all members of the GCC. And behind them is Israel. So there is a different strategic environment that I'm suggesting now exists that was not in place prior to the Abrahamic Accord.
Once again, I hope that what you're saying is true and will actually happen. Because the time, time flies when you're having fun. And we're almost at 9 o'clock. We do have some extra time given to us. I know that Salim wanted to say some closing remarks. We were speaking yesterday, and there's a lovely reference to Yigal Allon. So I will give the Zoom floor once again back to Salim for some closing remarks, and then I will have my own closing remarks. So Salim.
Thank you, David. I wanted to share something from my own background readings about Israeli history, Jewish politics, and so on and so forth, which becomes, in my view, very significant in terms of the time that we are living in, and in terms of what I have suggested in framing the issues in the context of the rise of the Asia-centric age as the Euro-centric age more or less fades away as the leading center of world politics. My own view, my own thinking on these matters is more cultural than, economic, political, and so on, because I do believe strongly in the view that culture is upstream and politics, economics, and everything associated is downstream. And we unfortunately don't pay too much attention to culture. So without further ado, I want to read to you a passage from his rather small book, but a very interesting book titled My Father's Home. You all know Yigal Allon. He belongs to that generation of Israeli leaders who were born in the Mandate. Yigal was born, if my memory serves me correctly, just at the end of World War I in 1918. As a Sabra, he, alongside Moshe Dayan, Itzhak Rabin, and others, became active in the politics of the Mandate and subsequently had a leading role in the making of Israel, both as a military officer and later on as a member of the Knesset, a politician who became a deputy prime minister and held many other portfolios. So he wrote this book late in his life as a reminiscence for his own family members about what it meant to people who had come back to the Holy Land, to Eretz Israel, in the second half of the 19th century, as his parents' generation, grandparents' generation did, and leave behind that history for his children and for the new generation of Israelis. So he talks, among many different things, is his education, the school that he went to in his village in the shores of southern Galilee, Sea of Galilee, and his school teachers and so on and so forth. And this passage jumps out, at least jumped out to me a long time ago when I read this book, or several years ago when I read this book, and I marked it out for myself. I did not know that I could end by citing Yigal Allon as, in a sense, the platform for my thesis or my framing of the issue that I did tonight for you. So here he goes. He's talking about his teachers in a little school in the southern shores of the Lake Galilee. He writes about this particular teacher among many teachers, a man by the name of Moshe Grinker. Moshe Grinker, I have profoundly affectionate memories of Moshe Grinker, my teacher from Yesud Hamala, who imbued us with a powerful love for the Bible and biblical land. This must have been in the late 1920s or early 30s, when the tension with the Arab population was sharpening. You all will remember that in 1929 was the Hebron massacre, and then came in the early 1930s, the beginning of the conflict. In modern terms, we would call it, or might call it, the Intifada of the Arabs against the settlers. And it is in that context that he's writing. He's at school, he's in his mid-teens, the memory that he's writing about. So he goes on then. The love of Bible, the biblical land, the Mishnah and selected chapters of the Talmud were also taught with emphasis on their relation to the living, tangible aspect of the country and the tillers of soil, and so on and so forth he describes. And then he comes. Grinker tried to give us an idea of the difference in the relations between Judaism and Christianity on the one hand, and Islam on the other. As he saw it, between Judaism and Christianity, there exists an everlasting enmity never to be bridged, owing to their controversy regarding the Messiah. The Christian religion, according to him, is hostile to Judaism, and he found support for his views in the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusade, and the blood libels. It was apparently under his influence that I behaved as I did in Nazareth upon confronting the churches and crucifixes. My teacher pinned his hopes on the understanding which was to be reached between Judaism and Islam. And he demonstrated the possibility of such an achievement by referring to the golden age of Jewish-Arab relations in medieval Spain, and before that in Arabia. He regarded the land of Israel as an inseparable part of the Orient, surrounded by traditional Muslim culture. He believed in the possibility of mutual understanding between Jews and Arabs, and never lost hope for the flowering of Jewish settlement in this part of the world. It is interesting to note that Papa, whose scars were evidence of his conflicts with the Arab, agreed with those views. This passage jumped out at me when I was reading it, as I said several years ago, and it becomes even more poignant and sharp as I've been discussing what I've discussed with you tonight. That in the emergent Asia-centric age, that history which Yigal Allon is talking about, and by the way, talking about in terms of his memories of the early 1930s when he's in school, and the scars that his father carried were, in some sense, the scars of the conflict that had already erupted. And yet, what he's pointing out is completely contrary to what is the common narrative. And the common narrative is that the Arab, Muslim, and Jewish relationship is somehow irreconcilable. My concluding remarks is that the generation that Yigal Allon and others represented and understood, they failed to use that understanding to bridge the gap. Why? Because the conflict that began with the Balfour Declaration became a conflict of two people claiming the same land on the basis of secular nationalism, even though their secular nationalism was dressed up in religious language. On the case of the Muslims, that is Arab Muslim, in terms of jihad and so on, and in terms of the Jews, secular nationalism dressed up as Zionism. If the approach at that time had been based upon sacred ground of religion, not secular ground, sacred ground of religion, we might have had a different history. But that ground is now rising. And as the Israelis feel more confident of themselves, as Yigal Allon says, that Israel is an inseparable part of the Orient, as in terms of their language, as in terms of the way they go about, they see themselves as an inseparable part of Orient. And the ground of meeting between Israelis and Arab is on the sacred ground of religion, Islam and Judaism. Muslims, as I have maintained, has no argument in denying the fundamental reality that the making of Israel is the return of their Semitic brothers back to their ancestral land, which is fully illuminated in their own sacred texts. You see, and the story would have been somewhat different. But it is that story which is surfacing far more than the other story, which is the lost Palestinian trope of secular nationalism. The Abraham Accord has turned the narrative back to what Yigal Allon is referring to. And with that, I see the promise of Israel in a different light in the Asia-centric age than it has been in the Euro-centric age.
Wow. Thank you very much, Salim. I hope that your words can be seen in hindsight as prophetic. As moderator, I'm going to take the prerogative of the last word. Salim, on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you for sharing your perspective as an outsider, but more importantly, as a Muslim friend to your Jewish brethren, as you yourself have referred to us. Thank you for opening our eyes to so many issues. Salim, when we conceived the series together, I didn't realize how it would flow in the way that it did, from optimism of the Abraham Accords in our first night together, through to, unfortunately, the pessimism of the vile United Nations globalist anti-Israel agenda, but now back again to perhaps an optimism that might blossom from an Asian-centric orientation for Israel. We have already seen some positive signs as Israel returns to its Asian hinge point, as you put it, positioning. Hopefully, this new direction does not repeat an anti-Semitic underpinning that so characterized the Euro-centric age. We have seen trade growing exponentially with the Sunni Arab countries that are signatories to Abraham Accords. We've seen expanding trade and diplomatic relations with India, a country, as you said, with the second largest Muslim population in the world. We have seen delegations of Indian Muslim imams visiting and looking at Israel differently. We are hopeful that it is just a matter of time that Saudi Arabia joins the Accords, as it has already opened up its airspace for flights from Israel to the UAE and to India. We can only hope that Israel's renowned innovation in technology related to agriculture, defense, medicine, water salination, to name but a few, are seen as a boon to the Asian neighbors who will work with Israel, despite or even because of the fear of Iranian hegemony. Salim, you've helped us realize that the gauntlet has been dropped for the Jews in the diaspora as to how best they can assist to changing Israel in its never-ending quest to be a respected and admired nation on the Asian stage, if not the world stage. Israel needs to be seen and understood in a different light. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Let us know if you'd like more of these types of talks in the future, or suggest other talks in the chat, or by emailing directly to Carrie Katz or Karen Goldenberg, who we once again thank for making this happen. Salim, thank you again. Stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy. Am Yisrael Chai, and good night.